What does it take to ruin a nearly perfect car? The Jaguar XJ X308 had one problem that followed it everywhere. A plastic timing chain tensioner buried deep in one of the most sophisticated V8 engines Jaguar had ever built that announced its failure every cold morning. 3 seconds of dry mechanical rattling. Then oil pressure built, the sound disappeared, and the engine settled into one of the most refined, unhurried idles in the luxury car world. That tension between what the X308 was and what was quietly undermining it is the whole story. There is a particular kind of confidence that comes from never being wrong enough to change. The Jaguar XJ body shell had that confidence. From the moment Sir William Lyons signed off on the original XJ's proportions in the 1960s, the long hood, the short deck, the fastback roofline that seemed to pull the car forward even when it was standing still, those decisions were simply never wrong enough to abandon. Not in 1979 when the Series 3 arrived. Not in 1986 when the XJ40 replaced it. Not in 1994 when the X300 followed. And not in 1997 when the X308 came to market. What looks like nostalgia from the outside is something more precise than that. It is a design philosophy that had been tested across 3 decades of real-world use and had simply kept passing. The X308's body shell is structurally and dimensionally continuous with the XJ40 introduced in 1986, which was itself developed as the successor to the Series 3 body, that traces its proportions directly to Lyons' original 1968 design. An X308 roofline carries the geometry of decisions made before the Apollo program concluded. No other major luxury manufacturer maintained a single body identity across that span of production without interruption. But platform continuity is not the same as platform stagnation, and that distinction matters enormously for understanding what the X308 actually was. By 1997, every stress path in that body shell had been documented across tens of thousands of production examples. Every corrosion initiation point was known. Every suspension characteristic had been calibrated, recalibrated, and calibrated again across a decade of accumulated development on the XJ, 40, and X300 platforms. The X308 did not inherit a tired old body. It inherited a body shell that had earned every refinement it carried. The most significant of those refinements addressed what had been the platform's most damaging long-term weakness. The original XJ40 body was not fully galvanized, and examples in high salt climates developed structural rust in sill sections and floor pan areas within 10 to 15 years of production. The corrosion warranty claims became expensive enough to force a change. During the X300's development in the early 1990s, full zinc galvanization was introduced across the body shell, a meaningful manufacturing investment that required changes to the body preparation process at Browns Lane. The X308 inherited that improvement. The practical evidence is visible in surviving examples today. X308 bodies in salt belt climates show surface corrosion at trim edges and wheel arches, the cosmetic kind, but generally intact structural sections. The XJ40 equivalents in the same climates tell a different story. So, what the X308 offered in 1997 was not a new car pretending to be timeless. It was a genuinely mature platform that had earned its proportions through decades of refinement. The ride quality that period reviewers consistently praised, the acoustic isolation that made the cabin feel separated from the world outside. Those characteristics did not appear by accident. They compounded over time, each generation of development adding another layer of calibration to a structure whose fundamental geometry had already proven itself. The body that refused to die had refused for good reason. But a beautiful body shell only tells part of the story. To truly escape the past, Jaguar needed a heart that was as modern as its silhouette was timeless. To understand what made the X308 different from every XJ that came before it, you have to understand what Jaguar was carrying into 1997. The XJ40 had arrived in 1986 with genuine engineering ambition. Its AJ6 inline-6 was a competent engine, refined enough, capable enough. But the car's electrical reputation had overwhelmed everything else. By the early 1990s, the XJ40's name had become shorthand for a particular kind of ownership anxiety the kind where you never quite trusted the car to start on a cold morning. That reputation followed Jaguar into every showroom conversation, every comparison test, every sales negotiation. The X308 needed an engine that could change the conversation entirely. What Jaguar produced was the AJV8, a 3,996 cubic centimeter, dual overhead, cam, V8 with an aluminum block and aluminum cylinder heads, 4 valves per cylinder, 90-degree bank angle. It was the most significant mechanical change in the XJ's history, since the original inline-six had defined the car's character in 1968. The naturally aspirated version produced 290 horsepower in North American specification. The supercharged XJR variant, fitted with an Eaton M90 positive displacement supercharger, produced 370. On paper, those numbers were competitive. In practice, the engine delivered something the numbers didn't fully capture, a smoothness at idle that made the cabin feel genuinely still, a power delivery that built progressively rather than arriving in a rush. Period reviewers from Car and Driver, Road and Track, and Autocar consistently noted the engine's refinement as the X308's strongest single attribute. After years of defending the XJ40's electrical temperament, Jaguar finally had a powertrain that needed no defending. But here is where the story becomes more complicated than the brochure suggested. The AJV8 was developed at Jaguar's Whitley Engineering Center in Coventry. The engineering decisions, the architecture, the character of the engine, those were genuinely Jaguar's work. But the capital required to bring that engine into production was not something Jaguar could have generated independently. Ford provided the financial and manufacturing investment for a new engine plant at Bridgend in South Wales, and it was at Bridgend that every AJV8 was built, on lines adjacent to Ford's own Duratec, VI6. The engine that made the X308 feel like pure Jaguar was built in infrastructure that Ford paid for. The independence was real in character and shared in everything else. That tension was not the only complication the AJV8 carried. The engine launched in 1997 in what Jaguar designated the AJ26 specification. It was a strong engine, but early production revealed two specific problems: a valve stem seal issue that produced oil consumption and blew smoke on startup, and a crankshaft position sensor specification that caused intermittent no-start conditions on some examples under specific temperature conditions. Jaguar addressed both problems. For 1999 production, the engine was quietly revised to AJ27 specification, with corrected valve stem seals and a revised sensor specification. The change was incorporated as a running production update, with no public announcement and no recall. 1998 model year cars universally have AJ26 engines. 1999 model year cars have AJ27 engines. The two specifications have different oil consumption characteristics, and most buyers, then and now, never knew the difference existed. It was the kind of quiet mid-production correction that manufacturers make when warranty claim patterns become clear enough to act on. Jaguar acted, and the AJ27 was a better engine for it. But the existence of that correction matters for anyone buying an X308 today, because the model year on the window sticker tells you which engine is under the hood. The engine was new, the electronics were new, but one legacy from the XJ40 era was proving harder to leave behind. The XJ40's electrical reputation had been built on something specific. It wasn't a vague sense that things went wrong. It was a documented pattern of Lucas-dominated components, relay clusters, module architectures, and wiring harnesses that degraded under the sustained stress of British weather, British roads, and British ownership cycles. The failures were unpredictable in timing and frustrating in diagnosis. A car that started fine on Tuesday might strand you on Thursday with no obvious explanation. The X308 addressed this directly. The CAN bus network that replaced the XJ40's isolated module architecture was a genuine engineering improvement, not a cosmetic one. Bosch Motronic engine management replaced Lucas fuel injection. The primary systems, engine, transmission, ABS, body control functions, now communicated through a single integrated network, rather than a collection of independently wired modules that had no reliable way to talk to each other. The engineering record of this transition is visible in NHTSA complaint data for the X308. Powertrain complaints are proportionally fewer than body electrical complaints, which is the opposite of the XJ40 pattern. The engineering team's priority had been achieved where it mattered most, but the body electrical system was a different story. Door lock mechanisms, switchgear, window regulators. These components still carried Lucas-era design philosophy into the new generation. Not because Jaguar's engineers were unaware of the problem, but because the platform's architecture meant that a complete electrical reinvention of every system simultaneously was not what the X308's development program was built to deliver. The CAN bus architecture reduced the frequency and unpredictability of electrical faults. It did not eliminate the inheritance entirely. This is where the title's one problem actually lands. Not a single catastrophic failure, not a design flaw that destroyed engines or rendered cars undrivable overnight, but a persistent inheritance that the new electronics could reduce and could not fully erase. The body electrical gremlins that had defined the XJ40's reputation followed the X308 forward in a quieter, less frequent form. Enough to sustain the narrative, enough to give cautious buyers a reason to choose the BMW 7 Series or the Mercedes S-Class instead. The AJV8 itself carried two failure modes worth understanding clearly, because the way they fail is as important as the fact that they fail. The timing chain tensioner is the first. The AJV8 uses a plastic hydraulic tensioner on its secondary timing chain, and this component can fracture at higher mileages. When it begins to fail, it announces itself. A cold start rattle, present for the first few seconds after the engine fires, that clears once oil pressure builds. The sound is consistent and recognizable. It can be present for 10,000 miles or more before the tensioner fails completely. The rattle is not an emergency. It is a warning, and it is a reliable one. Owners who know what to listen for have time to act. Tensioner replacement requires timing, cover removal, but not full engine disassembly. It is a significant service job, not a terminal diagnosis. The coolant system is the second. The all-aluminum engine requires specific coolant chemistry, and it is intolerant of air entrainment in the system. When coolant level drops or air enters, the engine becomes vulnerable to localized hotspots that can cause head gasket distortion. This is an expensive repair. It is also a preventable one. The X308 service documentation is specific about coolant chemistry requirements in a way that the XJ40-era documentation was not, which suggests Jaguar's engineers had studied the failure modes carefully and attempted to communicate the maintenance requirements clearly. What distinguishes both of these failure modes from the Nikasil bore wear that quietly destroyed early BMW E38 M60 engines is the nature of the warning. The Nikasil problem produced no audible signal and no progressive degradation visible to an attentive owner. By the time it was diagnosed, the engine was often beyond economic repair. The X308's failures rattle before they break and distort before they destroy. That distinction is not a minor detail. It is the difference between a car that punishes neglect suddenly and one that rewards attention consistently. The X308's problems were real. They were also the kind that a knowledgeable owner could manage. Understanding that distinction is what separates the cars that survive from the ones that don't. Understanding what the X308 was fighting against makes what was happening inside Brown's Lane feel even more significant. While the engineers battled plastic tensioners and inherited electrical gremlins, the craftsmen were still focused on perfection. At Brown's Lane in Coventry, craftsmen were hand-selecting walnut veneer sections from matched log sets, fitting grain patterns that flowed continuously across dashboards and door panels. Outside, Ford's efficiency consultants were walking the same floor with clipboards. The car being built was the most technically ambitious Jaguar XJ ever produced, a brand new V8 engine, a modern electronics architecture, a body shell refined across 30 years of accumulated development. Brown's Lane was not simply a factory, it was a place with a specific identity, one that had been building Jaguar vehicles since 1952, and had absorbed over those decades a manufacturing philosophy that was genuinely different from what was happening in Munich or Stuttgart or Nagoya. The German and Japanese luxury plants of the same period were optimizing for consistency through automation. Brown's Lane was optimizing for something harder to measure. Every X308 ever built came from those Coventry production lines, and the methods used to build them retained a degree of hand assembly that had no direct equivalent among the car's competitors. The clearest expression of that philosophy was the wood veneer work on the Vanden Plas trim level. The walnut veneer applied to the dashboard, door cappings, and center console was not pressed from a standardized sheet and fitted by a machine. Skilled craftsmen at Brown's Lane selected veneer sections from matched sets, sheets cut sequentially from the same log, specifically to ensure that the grain pattern ran continuously across the dashboard and into the door panels. The visual effect, when done correctly, is a cabin that feels grown rather than assembled. The grain moves across the interior as a single unbroken surface. Ford's own quality audits of Brown's Lane during the X308 production period documented this veneer process as one of the highest skilled manual operations in the entire assembly sequence. That documentation matters because it came from the organization that would eventually decide the process could not be justified at scale. Ford knew exactly what Brown's Lane was doing. The auditors wrote it down, and the decision to move production elsewhere was made anyway. That tension was present throughout the X308's production run. Ford's component procurement systems were being progressively introduced to Brown's Lane suppliers during those years. Some switchgear and electrical connectors transitioned to Ford-sourced equivalents as the production run continued. The hand assembly philosophy and the efficiency logic were operating simultaneously, in the same building, on the same cars. The X308 carries both influences depending on which component you examine and which model year it came from. There is a detail that American buyers of the X308 never had access to, one that speaks directly to the depth of what Brown's Lane was producing. In European markets, the equivalent car could be purchased as a Daimler, not a Jaguar with a different badge, but a car carrying a name that had supplied vehicles to the British royal household since 1900. The Daimler mark, which Jaguar had owned since 1960, continued through the X308 generation in Europe with a fluted grille, distinct badging, and a heritage that stretched back further than most automotive brands exist today. American buyers could not access that name. Trademark law in the United States reserved the Daimler name for Daimler-Benz, later Daimler Chrysler, preventing Jaguar from using it in that market. The equivalent specification arrived in North American showrooms as the Vanden Plas, with no indication of what it represented elsewhere in the world. The same car, the same hand-matched veneer, the same Brown's Lane craftsman, but without the century of royal association that the name carried in England. Brown's Lane's closure was announced by Ford in 2004. Production of the X350 successor had already transitioned to the Castle Bromwich plant, which had the space and equipment to handle the new aluminum body manufacturing process. The Coventry site that had assembled Jaguar vehicles for 53 years closed in July 2005. The X308 is the last Jaguar XJ ever assembled at the factory that built all of them from the beginning. Every production record, every VIN sequence, every hand-matched veneer panel traces back to that Coventry address. The factory closed, the platform was retired, but the X308 didn't disappear. And the reasons why it survived say something important about what it actually was. The X308 occupies an unusual position in the used car market. It is a 1990s British luxury sedan with a documented electrical inheritance, a timing chain tensioner that rattles when it wants attention, and a coolant system that requires specific chemistry to keep the aluminum engine healthy. By conventional logic, cars like this disappear. They become too expensive to maintain relative to their market value, parts dry up, and the specialist knowledge needed to service them retires along with the mechanics who carried it. The X308 did not disappear, and the reasons why are worth understanding carefully. The first reason is knowledge transfer. The XJ platform ran in continuous production from 1986 through 2009 across 3 generations. A mechanic who learned the XJ40's specific requirements in the 1990s carried directly applicable knowledge into X308 service. The fundamental architecture, the suspension geometry, the body structure, the electrical logic of the platform remained consistent enough that experience with one generation translated meaningfully to the next. Jaguar specialist workshops exist in most North American metropolitan areas today, in numbers disproportionate to the X308's actual production volume, because those specialists built their expertise across the entire platform lineage, not just the X308 alone. The second reason is parts interchangeability. The XJ40, X300, and X308 share a significant number of suspension components, body hardware items, and electrical system parts across their production runs. A failed window regulator or door lock mechanism on an X308 can often be sourced from X300 inventory. The effective parts pool for the X308 is substantially larger than its own 5-year production run would suggest, because 3 generations of the same fundamental platform created a combined inventory that no single generation could have sustained independently. The transmission adds another layer to this. The ZF5 HP24 gearbox, fitted to every North American X308, was simultaneously used in the BMW 7 Series E38 and in the Aston Martin DB7 of the same period. Every transmission specialist who learned to rebuild the 5 HP24 through BMW service, a far larger population of vehicles than the X308, is fully qualified to service the Jaguar's gearbox, valve body repair kits, torque converter rebuild specifications, fluid requirements. All of it developed for the BMW application applies directly to the X308. The X308 benefits from a specialist ecosystem it never had to build for itself. The third reason is the nature of the failure modes, which were covered earlier but deserve to be understood in a broader context here. The BMW E38 of the same period, which scored better than the X308 in period consumer reliability surveys, has followed a less robust survival trajectory in the used market. Early E38 examples fitted with the M60Y8 engine suffered necausal cylinder bore coating failures caused by high sulfur fuel content. That failure produced no audible warning, no progressive degradation visible to an attentive owner. By the time it was diagnosed, the engine was typically beyond economic repair. The X308 has no equivalent failure mode. Its timing chain tensioner rattles before it breaks. Its transmission degrades gradually through shift quality rather than sudden collapse. Its head gasket gives warning before the block is lost. None of its primary failure modes requires immediate vehicle replacement when caught with reasonable attention. Jaguar's Classic Parts program has reinforced this survival trajectory institutionally. Most manufacturers do not maintain systematic parts supply for vehicles more than 2 decades old. Jaguar does, through a formal program that treats its heritage vehicles as an active brand asset rather than a liability to be quietly discontinued. The availability of genuine parts through official channels alongside the aftermarket ecosystem that the platform's long production run created means that an X308 owner today has more options than the car's age would typically allow. The X308 survives not because it was perfect. It survives because its imperfections were human. And that humanity is exactly what makes its place in history so remarkable. The story of the X308 is sometimes told as a tragedy. The last pure Jaguar, strangled by corporate logic before it could fulfill its promise. That framing is emotionally satisfying and factually imprecise. Ford's ownership of Jaguar predated the X308 by 8 years. The AJV8 required Ford's capital to exist. The ZF transmission was selected under Ford's supplier programs. The bridge and engine plant was Ford-funded. The X308 is not a pre-Ford Jaguar. It is a Ford-era Jaguar that still carried the hand assembly practices, the veneer craftsman, and the Browns Lane identity that Ford's efficiency logic would eventually conclude it could not justify at scale. That distinction matters because it makes the X308 story more interesting than a simple before and after narrative allows. What the X308 actually represents is a specific and unrepeatable moment, the point at which a platform had reached genuine maturity, and the organization that built it had not yet fully become something else. The body shell had been refined across 3 generations until its corrosion protection, its ride calibration, and its acoustic isolation had compounded into something that a newer platform would have taken years to replicate. The AJV8 had arrived with enough refinement to change the conversation about Jaguar's reliability. The craftsmen at Browns Lane were still matching veneer grain by hand, and Ford's auditors were still writing it down as the highest skilled operation on the floor. All of that existed simultaneously, in the same building, on the same cars, for a window of time that closed before most people recognized it was open. The X350 that followed was a remarkable piece of engineering, an all-aluminum monocoque body that shed roughly 40% of the steel X308's body weight. Stiffer, lighter, more modern in every measurable structural sense. But it was assembled at Castle Bromwich, not Browns Lane. It carried more shared components with other Ford products. The craftsmen who had matched veneer sections from sequentially cut log sheets did not transfer their specific knowledge to a new aluminum body process. The X350's proportions continued the XJ silhouette. The platform, the factory, and the hands did not follow. The body shape that traced back to Sir William Lyons's decisions in the 1960s ended its unbroken platform lineage with the X308. The silhouette persisted into the X350 and beyond. But the lineage, the accumulated refinement of a single evolving structure across 3 decades of continuous development that ended when the last X308 rolled off the Browns Lane line in December 2002. There is something worth sitting with in that. Not grief exactly, more like the particular appreciation that comes from understanding what a thing actually was, rather than what the mythology around it suggests. The X308 was built during a transition, carried the marks of that transition in its components, and still managed to be the fullest expression of what the XJ platform had been working toward since 1986. That is not a consolation. That is the achievement. The X308 wasn't the last Jaguar, but it was the last one built the way Jaguar had always built them, by hand, at Browns Lane, on a platform that had earned every refinement it carried across 30 years of continuous development. That cold start rattle the engineers built into their warning system was, in its own way, the perfect symbol for all of it. A car sophisticated enough to tell you when something was wrong, built by hands careful enough to match walnut grain across a dashboard, and assembled in a factory that Ford's own auditors documented, admired, and ultimately closed. They just don't make them like that anymore. If this kind of story resonates, the next one is waiting. In 1998, Toyota faced the same tension between past and future with the Land Cruiser 100, a legendary V8, a platform built to last, and a choice that defined the brand. That video is up next.